This is not the piece I thought I was going to be making on this.
This is the last nook. My dad refuses to tell me what this means.
Originally, I was going to make some jokes about Jarrod, I suppose, and tell you about the time I realized a huge tactical flaw in the GABA anti-terrorism security and how I got into a ground in South Africa without any ticket or press accreditation all the way into the press box itself. There's also a lot more serious stuff I want to talk about with Pakistan. You know, what happened with New Zealand, how it was different to England, the New Zealand women's team and the threat there. Not to mention the politics of what the ECB did and how they released their statement, and maybe some jokes at the chairman of YouTube, Ramiz Raja. I mean, there is actually a lot of really interesting issues that have come out of this, and a lot of them have already been written about and talked about on podcasts with other people. Like, why weren't the English women consulted before the ECB pulled out of that tour? And also, how comfortable do we feel with the fact that players need presidential level security to play a cricket series? But I'm going to go in a completely different direction because there's something that's just been gnawing at me, and every time I tried to write the other piece, I kept coming back to my sort of central problem with all this. We're going to talk about when India cancelled the last test against England. You'll probably remember just how terrified the ECB were, and they started talking about how they were going to lose £30 million in revenue, how this was a huge problem, and Ravi Shastri's book launch, all that sort of stuff went on. There's no doubt you're going to have your own thoughts on India cancelling that test. But I want to look at this just in a different way. Virat Kohli has a 7 crore contract with the BCCI for international matches, and India played 33 international matches in the last 12 months. If you split that up straight away, he's getting around £22,000 per game. Now, being that some of these games are tests and the cancelled match was certainly a test, I think you can bump that up a little bit, although I'm not sure that's how the contracts actually work. But let's say £35,000 per test. That's not involving match fees. Match fees are around £15,000. There's obviously per diems and mobile fees and laundry costs and all sorts of things. But more or less, we could say that Virat Kohli is getting between £40,000 and £50,000 to play in that test versus England, which is a $30 million game, according to the ECB. Now, all of this is very back of a napkin stuff, and it may not be completely accurate. I've just put it together sort of off the top of my head, having a look at a few different numbers out there. But it also doesn't matter, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, obviously Virat Kohli is going to get paid more for this test than just that money I've talked about, because as we say in the business, he'll get exposure. He'll be able to get advertising and sponsors and partnerships and all the other little things, maybe speaking engagements on the back of this. None of that money, whether it be his match fee, whether it be the BCCI contract, whether it be any of the other monies I've mentioned, come out of that $30 million. Everything that Kohli gets paid to play in that game directly is paid by the BCCI, and they don't get any of that $30 million either. They get their hotels and planes covered, but they don't actually take a split of the money that the ECB make. The only way the BCCI can make their money, and the way that Virat Kohli eventually makes his money, is because England then travel back to India. So precisely 0% of the £30 million go to Virat Kohli and his lesser paid teammates for actually playing in this game. If you remember, England was spun as this powerless noob to India's throbbing behemoth, but England set this system up, and they've been using this system for a very long time. Players like Richard Hadley, Garfield Sobers, Viv Richards, Wasam Akram, Sanjay Surya, Alan Donald. You can name anyone you want from almost any period of history. They come over to England and they are used to help market the test series, of which England makes all the money, and these particular players do not get a slice of it. The ECB know their market is worth more than others, but they've never offered to split the profits or help out other countries in that way. Yes, they tour the other countries, but the other country is never going to make back that amount of money. India is the first country who really can make more money than England can. So the ECB have been, the ECB and the TCCB and the MCC have all been happy to make money over their time exploiting players from overseas countries that they know would never get paid as much. Think about it this way. Kohli is the main protagonist in the India-England Test Series, even more so than any English player. He is the face that is used almost all the time on all the adverts, on all the promotions. It's Kohli. Everyone is talking about Kohli in England, and he makes no money from that particular share that England are going to make. And he'll be fine because he's rich and we don't have to worry about Virat Kohli in that particular way. But this shows just how broken the entire system is. And it's this weird, stupid handshake deal that basically causes all the problems in world cricket and brings us back to Pakistan. It's why a team can cancel at the last minute and nothing really happens to them. And let me just give you one more example. The Australian cricket team. They are They're the best played cricketers pretty much in international cricket. And they get a 25% share of what Cricket Australia make. But like Kohli, when they come to England, they don't make a share of that. They get paid match fees and they obviously have their overall contract, but they don't actually get any of the money directly from that series. They have to wait for their money to be earned by England coming to Australia. And what if England doesn't come to Australia, which at the moment looks, a small possibility? That means the Australian players will get paid less money, even though they help the ECB get rich for, hundreds of years, really. Now, the Ashes will be replayed because they're the Ashes and they're going to fit them in any way they can. But maybe they'll be a neutral venue and they'll make less money. Or maybe they'll be shortened and they'll make less money. Or maybe they'll be out of a popular season and they'll make less money. All these things could impact how much money the Australian cricketers make. And this is fine for the Ashes because it's in both boards' interest for it to go ahead one way or another, even if there's a little bit less money to be made. That isn't always the case though, is it? And we're talking about cricket's third most powerful nation and its most marketable, famous cricketer. And yet they are both sort of exploited by this stupid system that doesn't make any sense. So what happens when you don't have power? Well, Pakistan happened. And what will happen to Pakistan is obviously far worse than Virat Kohli not cashing in on the money that he should be from international cricket, or all the Australian players taking a bit of a haircut on their incredible pay that they already get, which they earn, don't get me wrong. But I think you have to go back to when tours first started to understand why we have this system in the first place. Basically, in those days, you would invite a group of players over and they would come. You would make your money from inviting them over and hosting the events, and they would make their money by playing. It meant that the players were paid and the hosts were paid. That started to change when cricket boards started to get involved. In fact, in cricket's golden era, it's called cricket's golden era, but it's basically almost exclusively white men playing the sport. Single women were allowed to play cricket, but not always married women. It's not really a golden era. But anyway, that's what they call it. In that era, Victor Trumper went on strike. And he's like the most pure of pure cricketers of all time. And yet Victor Trumper went on strike because he wasn't happy with the way that the board were doing things. That was the period where the Imperial Cricket Conference was formed, which has become the International Cricket Council. That's basically the birth of modern cricket right there. And it started with a strike where one of the gun players didn't go because he wasn't happy with how he was being treated. And if the bilateral series once worked, and let's remember cricket was started so early, maybe there wasn't a better system that they could have been able to use at that time. It certainly doesn't work now. There are so many teams and too much cricket, and the disparity in TV revenue just makes it all kind of unmanageable or untenable. Teams are now forced to go on tour to get more teams to play them. And that brings in politics and the moment where England realised that their summer was going to be ruined, so they just called in a bunch of favours knowing that these teams would have to tour them because that's where they're going to get their money when England tour them. That's not a clever system. Let's imagine, as hard as it might be, that our sport was run correctly. That the ICC was an independent organisation that was in charge of the sport, not just making sure that the umpires turn up and that they host a few events. And then this new ICC that was in charge of cricket would look at the current system and go, do you know what, this is a very, very old business plan and it doesn't currently serve the sport. And we think if we want to continue with international cricket, and we're the ICC, so it's in our best interest to continue with international cricket, it needs to be 3 leagues. And not just 3 leagues in name only, those leagues have to be sold as leagues, as one big TV rights package. If you still want to play bilateral cricket and you think you have time, feel free, but the majority of international cricket will be part of a Test league, an ODI league, and a T20 league, and we will sell the rights to that so that no one else has to worry about it. The ICC could then keep the streaming rights themselves, set up cricket.tv, and cricket fans from all around the world currently that are using illegal streams or just missing games will be able to log in and subscribe to whatever cricket that they want to watch. The ICC would have much more information about who's watching cricket, where they're watching cricket, and how they want to consume their cricket. The cricket boards wouldn't have to worry about going out and getting individual deals. You could have the operational costs actually covered by the deal itself. You could pay the players out of the general pool rather than having each individual team pay them directly, so that every player was paid closer to the same amount. If the really rich boards wanted to, they could still pay their players on top of that as well. We would have a schedule that was actually locked in, that made sense, and that was building towards something at the end. Qualification for tournaments and finals and series and all those sorts of things. There would be more money, organisation, security, clarity, and cricket boards would be able to go back to developing cricket in their nations to make sure that every single cricket nation is getting stronger. But let's imagine that this thing happened before New Zealand and England pulled out of the Pakistan series. What would happen in a league like this? England and New Zealand would forfeit their points, which means it might be slightly harder for them to qualify for world events. Now, they might not be that worried about that because that kind of already happens as it is. So that's not the end of the world. But they would also lose the share of money that they cost the revenue rights. It would mean the team that cancelled the series would miss out on the money that would have been generated by that series. Not the other team, just that team. I think that the team who cancelled the series would also be within their rights to ask to have the series replayed, perhaps at a neutral venue if they felt like they couldn't go to, let's say, Pakistan. But in order to do that, they would have to pay the difference between the home costs and the neutral costs. And perhaps Pakistan would still be within their right to go, no. We set up the game, you cancelled at the last minute, we've got our points, we've got our money, thanks for coming. Of course, before the league, you could have teams opting in and out of touring certain places. There could be, in a proper league, discussions made about how people play and where they play and why they play and how often they play. But we don't live in that world. We live in the handshake. But we don't live in that world, obviously, and it's all gone to hell again. So the boards make usually short-term decisions that they think are in their best interest, quite often not in the best interest of the actual players that have made them the money. And remember, in this particular case, England were talking about a goodwill tour of sorts. England were looking after all the teams that had looked after them during COVID. It was a patronising name and also silly. If you really wanted to look after these other cricket teams, there could have been a shared revenue option. These teams helped the ECB not go bankrupt, and now the ECB has turned around and shafted one of them almost immediately. And Pakistan and most of the smaller nations really need a lot more than goodwill. They need financial security, and this system does not allow for that. And Pakistan have just had a cold cuppa poured over their head to prove that. And Pakistan have just had another realization that that's the case. I mean, in all truth, Pakistan's best option right at the moment is to have the Pakistan Super League, the PSL, for 4 months of the year, almost straight away. And then look to expand that to 5, 6, 7 months of the year. Make it a proper league. Make sure there is a game every night of the year. Make sure it's around your local players. That it dominates the TV and the newspapers. That it becomes the biggest thing in town consistently. And then the rest of the year, you can look at playing international games if, there's guarantees from the other teams. And I mean financial guarantees that they will actually go ahead with the series that they have promised to play. And obviously Pakistan is the biggest victim of this, although you could argue that kind of all of cricket is the biggest victim of this. But I do want to talk about the England players here as well. We know that they are willing to travel to Pakistan for the PSL for very high wages. But many of them would not have made much money from actually going on this particular tour. Again, the PCB would have made money, but not the English cricketers. That same system. And as for the English players, they play like a lot of cricket. In the last 5 years, they've averaged 91 days of cricket per year. So missing out on a couple of 11 overs games isn't really going to affect the bank balances of many of these players, and they're already tired. In fact, if they were supposed to be playing in the IPL, and in fact, if they were playing in the IPL, they're going to have to take a pay cut to play in some of these games. And that's the other thing, that the economics of this doesn't make sense. People say you should pick your country over your club, but the country hasn't picked these players. The country is making a lot of money and not filtering all that money down to the players. These are professional athletes, and they have between 12 and 15 years of earning potential, and quite often maximum earning potential is a lot less than that. They're going to go towards the money. The history of sport, of capitalism, of economics has always told us this. There will be some players who won't, but the vast majority will go towards what they have to secure their futures. And to an England player, this is just more cricket that really isn't that financially beneficial to them. And you'll be shocked to know that players from England and India were very tired of too much cricket before COVID. And that has just made everything worse. Think about Virat Kohli again. He had to play the World Test Championship final, then he had to play a big series against England, then he's gone into the IPL, then he's got the World Cup, back to back to back to back. And you've got this billion-dollar industry that is a bunch of handshakes from a bunch of quite often unpaid chairmen, almost always men, who make decisions that are not really in the best interest of, well, anyone other than the board members themselves. And it's bilateral agreements with a couple of ICC parties thrown in. You could say the system is broke, but I'm not sure there actually is a system. The BCCI get this bad rep for running cricket. No one runs cricket. It just bumps around until it hits the next crisis. Pakistan is a victim of this now, and so are many of the players all around the world. So are many of the fans. If Virat Kohli isn't getting paid directly for playing in a big test, I mean, if we can't look after Virat Kohli, the game's biggest star, when he plays in a big test, and he's thinking, what is the point of me playing in this? How are we running cricket at all? It's just an absolute... we might as well just headbutt a wall. You can argue that Pakistan was a victim of Western skittishness and smaller markets and power imbalance. And there is anger and sadness at the thought of them having to go back to the sort of homeless abyss that they only recently crawled out of. But if you keep running cricket like it's a private members club with a bunch of handshakes, then what happened to Pakistan and most of the rest of cricket is not an accident, it's inevitable.